You know, they say some stories cling to you long after they happen. This one certainly did for me, for decades, like a shadow that never quite leaves your side. It was back during my hostel days, a time when friendships were strong, but so, apparently, were other things we couldn't see. It was a humid summer night, thick with the heavy, drowsy silence that only a hostel in the countryside can manage. I'd just drifted off to sleep when I was jolted awake by the urgent pounding on my door and a frantic voice calling my name over and over. It was Samuel, my friend from the next room. There he stood, wild-eyed and drenched in sweat, as though he'd seen something I couldn't even imagine. Next to him stood Patrick, his roommate, oddly calm, yet with a crease of worry that made him look older in the yellowed hallway light. I opened the door, just barely making out the shaken expressions of my other two roommates, Charles and Nelson, who had groggily come to see what the fuss was about. Samuel stumbled into the room, practically dragging Patrick behind him, and whispered, "Close the door. Please, close it now." "What happened?" I asked, though I could already sense the fear crawling down my spine as his eyes darted around the room. Samuel stammered out a reply, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw her. She was just sitting there." "Who?" I asked, trying to hide my unease. His eyes flicked to Patrick, who was nodding along, then back to me. "There was a lady right there on my study chair by the bed. She was looking at me." He shivered, and despite the oppressive heat, I felt a cold prickle dance down my arms. When Samuel described her, my heart skipped a beat. Dressed in white, silent and still, she had stared at him with an intensity that held him paralyzed. In the dim glow of his room's corner light, he saw her so clearly that he could make out her expression, blank yet somehow seething, her eyes boring into him. Samuel had tried to scream but couldn't. His voice had died in his throat, and all he'd managed was a desperate kick to Patrick, jolting him awake just in time to see nothing but an empty chair. Now let me give you some background. This wasn't your typical hostel prank or midnight tale. I'd always considered myself brave, or at least that's what my friends thought. They were convinced that because I often took the escape route from the hostel in the early hours, climbing over a gap in the boundary wall to get to the railway station for tea, I was unshakable. But that night, I found myself closing the skylights, checking every shadow twice, and even glancing behind my own reflection in the darkened window. And as I did, I felt that I, too, wasn't alone. As the night crawled on, I noticed how restless Samuel was, even as Patrick tried to laugh it off. By dawn, the word had spread, as these things do in close quarters, and the whispers began. Stories about a girl who had lived in the nearby girls' hostel 7 years prior, a quiet one with a mesmerizing voice. She'd come from a rural village, seeking higher education, but had met a tragic end after a broken relationship. The details were hauntingly familiar to everyone on our campus. Her sad, beautiful voice, and the lonely, unbearable heartbreak that had eventually driven her to take her own life. I couldn't get her story out of my head. The next night passed uneventfully, but the Tuesday that followed didn't. I remember lying awake, tensed and ready for anything, half convinced it was just nerves. Then, just like before, Samuel was at my door, shaking, eyes hollow. This time he hadn't even made it through the door before he whispered, "She's back." Charles tried to brush it off, but the fear was infectious. Samuel clung to me, trembling, and as he did, his words grew frantic. "She's going to kill me," he muttered over and over, his voice cracking. She had that look, the look of someone who wants revenge. We couldn't leave him alone after that. We spent the entire night in his room, armed with whatever makeshift weapons we could gather. A rusted iron rod, a couple of knives, some old cards, and puffed rice for company, as if they'd somehow protect us. And though I couldn't sleep, I forced myself to stay calm for Samuel's sake. For hours, nothing happened, and when dawn broke, I thought maybe, just maybe, it was over. But something in me knew it wasn't. When Tuesday came around again, a local student approached me, mentioning an old necromancer who lived on the outskirts of town. Desperate, we decided to pay him a visit, borrowing a rickety old bike and cycling through the dusty streets under the harsh midday sun. His place was strange, filled with an overpowering smell of incense, and he seemed almost to smile as we told him our story, as if he knew her, or worse, like he knew us. After listening, he told Samuel to remove a simple amulet he'd been wearing, a gift from his mother years before, something we'd all taken for granted. That was it. No exorcism, no dramatic ritual. Just take it off, he said with a nod. We left, still unsure if anything would change. When Tuesday came again, we bunkered down, all of us in one room, waiting. Hours passed in tense silence as the tick of a clock became a strange comfort. And, to our disbelief, nothing happened. By the time dawn crept in, we were exhausted, but safe. Somehow, for reasons we didn't fully understand, it was over. I couldn't explain it then, and I still can't, even after all these years. But sometimes, late at night, I think back to those days, to Samuel's haunted face, and the whispers we used to exchange about that girl's spirit. And I wonder if perhaps she didn't want him after all, but had simply come to remind us, as we fell asleep each night, that some heartbreaks refuse to be forgotten. This experience lingered in our minds, a constant, quiet reminder that sometimes the past clings to the present like an unseen shadow, refusing to let go. And if there's anything I learned, it's that some spirits, some memories, find a way of staying with you forever. My name is Liam, and though I hesitate to share this story, it's the only way I know to escape the grip this nightmare has held on me. Maybe if I tell you, it'll lose its power over me. Maybe then, I'll finally be free. It began one morning, a mundane morning, like any other, except for a single, haunting detail that shifted my world. I'd woken up, bleary-eyed, and stumbled into the bathroom to brush my teeth. But as I stared into the mirror, something strange caught my eye. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. It was subtle, almost as if I'd imagined it. My reflection, it was me. And yet, it wasn't. The eyes seemed darker, hollow, and when I forced a smile to shake off the unease, the grin that stretched back at me seemed sharper. I laughed it off, chalking it up to my mind playing tricks. But deep down, a faint unease stirred. I tried to let it go, convinced it was just a trick of the light. But over the next few days, it didn't go away. Every time I looked in a reflective surface, my bathroom mirror, a passing window, even the glint of a polished metal object, I'd catch a glimpse of myself, just a split second out of sync, or worse. With a face twisted into a mocking smile. I wasn't smiling, but my reflection was. When I told my friends and family, they laughed it off or gave me that look, the one people give when they think you're teetering on the edge. "It's just stress, Liam," they'd say, their faces a blend of amusement and concern. "You need sleep, that's all." Maybe they were right. I started wondering if I was losing my mind, feeling an unfamiliar chill every time I glanced in the mirror, as if a silent predator were lurking there waiting. I turned to the only solace I knew, my faith. I immersed myself in prayer, clinging to the comfort of the words, pleading for peace, for protection. But that's when things took a darker turn. The more I prayed, the bolder my reflection became. No longer confined to mirrors, it would appear in windows, and even polished metal surfaces. And every time, the expression on its face grew more sinister. The mocking smile widened, teeth bared in a grin that felt less like a reflection and more like an invitation. My prayers didn't seem to banish it. In fact, they seemed to fuel it. And then, the pain started. It began with a dull ache in my bones, a heaviness that settled deep within me. I could feel it spreading, like an infection. My skin grew pale, drawn, almost sickly, and dark bruises began to appear. Scratches too, long, thin lines that I'd discover each morning, stinging as I washed my face. Each prayer seemed to make it worse. I started wondering if my prayers weren't a shield, but rather an open door. Had I invited something dark, something unholy, into my life? The bruises worsened, the pain grew sharper, and it wasn't just physical, it was mental too. I'd lash out at people without warning, my patience evaporating in an instant, my words cutting and cold. A dark anger boiled inside me, fierce and bitter, unlike anything I'd felt before. I felt like a puppet, my strings pulled by unseen hands. Still, I clung to my faith, hoping that my resolve would somehow push the evil away. But every attempt felt like I was clawing at a wall, unable to get even a foothold. My prayers echoed back at me like hollow whispers, like pleading into a void. One night, at my wit's end, I collapsed before the mirror, staring at the twisted version of myself staring back. My voice cracked as I cried out, "Why, God? Why would you leave me like this?" My words were filled with despair, my voice thick with anger and something else, a bitter sense of betrayal. As my voice faded, the mirror went still. My reflection looked back at me, its face devoid of the mockery, the sneers. It was me. Or so I thought. A strange emptiness settled over me. The demon, if that's what it was, had vanished. I felt lighter, as though I'd finally won the fight I'd been losing for weeks. Exhausted and drained, I staggered to bed, my heart feeling hollow in a way I couldn't quite describe. But as I lay there, drifting into a shallow sleep, something stirred. A shadow flickered in my peripheral vision. There was a darkness lurking, settling comfortably where my faith had once been. And there, just on the edge of my awareness, I saw it. The echo of a grin in the blackness of my mind. As the shadow deepened, I realized too late that I hadn't banished the demon. I'd given it a home. In the days that followed, the reflection no longer needed mirrors. It was with me, in me, settled comfortably within my soul. And I knew with a bone-chilling certainty that I would never be rid of it. I wasn't just haunted by a demon. I had become it. I remember that first night in my flat, lying there and staring up at the ceiling, excitement buzzing in my veins. I had finally made it to Birmingham, and everything felt surreal. My little flat was run down but cozy enough, tucked close to the university, and just within my budget. The only odd thing about it was the view, an enormous ancient cemetery stretching far into the distance, tombstones crumbling with age, each one standing as a silent reminder of the countless souls resting below. At first, I didn't mind it too much. I even laughed it off with my friends, who teased me about the haunted view. But as I lay there, night after night, I felt an indescribable unease. I'd hear the faintest of whispers when the wind blew through my open window, and shadows seemed to linger just beyond my sight, as if something watched and waited. In the daylight, I could brush off the feeling, convincing myself it was just my nerves. Moving to a new country, after all, is a big change. But each night the unease crept in, and sleep came only in fits. The dreams began a few nights later, starting innocently enough. At first, I'd dream about walking up a hill with my friends under a bright sky. But as we climbed, I'd notice the tombstones, scattered at first but growing denser, until we were surrounded by them, a hidden cemetery blanketing the hillside. And then, out of nowhere, shadows would leap at me from behind those gravestones, and I'd wake up screaming, drenched in sweat. "You're just overthinking it," my friends told me. They joked, "The last girl who lived there thought it was creepy too. But there's nothing to worry about, it's just an old cemetery." Their words did little to soothe me. The cemetery didn't feel old. It felt alive, like something slumbering just beneath the surface, waiting. I grew desperate to shake the feeling, attempting to stay awake through the night, but exhaustion took its toll, and eventually, I fell asleep. That night, the dream changed. I found myself standing at the cemetery's entrance, the iron gates looming before me. A voice, distant and low, called out my name, carried on a breeze that chilled me to the bone. My heart screamed at me to run, to get away, but my legs moved of their own accord, leading me into the cemetery, as if I had no control over my own body. The deeper I went, the thicker the fog became, cloaking everything in a hazy shroud. Yet still, I followed the voice. I reached a clearing, and the fog parted just enough to reveal something strange. A merry-go-round, its paint chipped and rusty, sitting right there among the graves. But this was no ordinary ride. Instead of horses or seats, it held coffins, each one draped with a thick layer of moss. As I stood there, the merry-go-round creaked to life, spinning in slow, groaning circles. A haunting melody filled the air, a tune so mournful it sent chills through my spine. And then I saw her, a figure sitting in one of the coffins, her face hidden beneath a red lace veil. The ride turned slowly, and with each rotation, she seemed to edge closer to me. My body screamed to run, to wake up, but I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot. The veil brushed against my skin, sending icy shivers down my spine. And finally, I managed to scream, but no sound came out. My voice had been swallowed by the eerie melody, leaving me voiceless and terrified. As the ride turned again, her hand extended, reaching closer, closer, until the cold touch of her fingers grazed my arm, feeling like death itself. I awoke with a jolt, gasping for air, my heart hammering in my chest. My sheets were damp with sweat, my body frozen in fear. But as I looked around, something caught my eye. Dirt. Clumps of dark soil scattered across my bed, and an earthy smell filled the room. The logical part of my mind tried to reason it away. Maybe the window had blown some dirt in, but my window was shut tight. No, this dirt wasn't from outside. It felt wrong. Over the next few days, the nightmares only worsened, each one dragging me back to that cemetery. Every dream ended the same way. Me, paralyzed as the woman drew closer, her face hidden behind the red lace, her cold hand reaching out for me. Each morning I'd wake to find dirt on my bed, more than before. The gritty, damp soil had a distinct smell, a rotting, earthy scent that felt like the very essence of death itself. One night, I resolved to stay awake, drinking coffee and watching movies, until my eyes burned. But eventually, sleep claimed me. This time, the dream was clearer, more vivid than ever. I found myself standing in front of the merry-go-round, its ancient wood creaking as it spun on its own. The woman was there waiting, her hand extended toward me. Her face, pale and hollow, was finally visible beneath the lace. A face gaunt with empty, sunken eyes that stared through me, as though I were already dead. In that moment, I felt her touch, colder than ice. A grip so strong I couldn't pull away. I woke up gasping, my heart nearly stopping, my room darker than pitch. It took me a moment to realize what was wrong. My bed, my entire bed, was covered in dirt and mud. Streaks of it smeared over my sheets, my clothes, even my face. It felt as if I'd been dragged through the earth itself, as if the cemetery had followed me, its grasp pulling me deeper each night. My friends, hearing my terrified scream, rushed in. I could see the horror in their eyes as they took in the sight, me covered in dirt, my face pale as a ghost, shaking uncontrollably. There were no words left. They knew I was no longer simply having nightmares. This was something else, something dark and ancient that had seeped into my life, consuming me. From that night forward, I knew one thing for sure. The cemetery didn't want to be forgotten. It was alive in a way I couldn't understand, reaching out through centuries to claim anyone who dared to live in its shadow. And no matter where I went, how far I ran, I would never be able to shake its presence. The cemetery had claimed me as its own. And remember, some places never forget, and some things never rest. So next time you feel a chill or hear a whisper in the dark, ask yourself, is it really just your imagination? Sweet dreams, if you can sleep. If you enjoyed this tale of terror, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because there are many more dark stories waiting in the shadows. And remember, next time you feel like you're being watched, maybe you are. Sleep well, if you dare,